I showed up unexpectedly at the company party and caught the boss dancing with my wife. I froze at that scene. When they saw me they were shocked. The music didn't stop, but time did. His eyes were still fixed on hers, his hands were firmly holding her waist, their bodies were too close for a simple social greeting. My feet glued to the floor, and a deafening silence took over me. The surrounding conversations turned into distant noise. The smiles faded, and the look she gave me when she saw me was confirmation of something that, until then, I refused to believe. It wasn't just a dance. It was the dance of someone who had already rehearsed those steps before, of someone who knew themselves in the dark, in the forbidden, in the intimate. It was the choreography of a betrayal. In the days that followed, I realized that hell is not a place with fire and chains, but rather living with unanswered questions. How did I not notice before? When did it all start? How many times have you lied looking into my eyes? Every memory, every laugh from her, became a knife slowly turning inside my chest. And he, that man who shook my hand every morning, who praised me in meetings, who toasted my merits as if he were rooting for me, was him. My superior. The man with the most power within the company. It wasn't just a marital betrayal, it was a double stab, because they both conspired behind my back. They slept together, and the next day, they both shared the meeting room with me. Accomplices in pleasure and lies. She came home smiling, as if nothing had happened, and I, blinded by love, believed everything. The connections at night, because the project was delayed, the last-minute dinners with people from the financial sector, the new underwear that were just for a change, the different perfume that got from a friend, everything made sense now. And more than anger, it was disgust at having laid down next to someone who, deep down, had already given himself to someone else. Someone who laughed with me in the living room but undressed for another man in some hotel room. After that night, something inside me died. And when something dies, you either bury it or transform it. I chose to transform. Silently, I began to dig deep. Every conversation, every email, every clue. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I dressed in silence and coldness. I pretended that nothing had changed, that it was just another ordinary day, that I was the same. But inside, something was growing, a kind of strategic coldness, a calculated anger that kept me from sleeping and forced me to act. For days I walked among them as if I knew nothing, but everything in me burned. I watched them like a wolf watches its prey, attentive, patient, waiting for the right moment. And that time has come. What they didn't know was that I was no longer just an employee. For months, he had been approached by investors interested in the company. My results had attracted attention. And when I was offered a partnership in a new project that had the potential to explode on the market, I accepted, but with one condition, that part of the investment would be used to buy the percentage of shares that would give me power within the current company. They said it would be risky. I said it was personal. And then, in the same room where they used to laugh at me secretly, I walked in wearing the suit that they would never have imagined would represent the beginning of the end for both of them. I became a majority shareholder with a simple signature. A silent, clean, direct blow. And at the next meeting, when the old boss walked in with that superior smile, I met his eyes and just said, "Your chair is now mine. And you're fired." The silence that took over the room was almost poetic. He tried to laugh, make fun, minimize it. But the contract was already registered. Power had already changed hands. And the woman who, until then, thought I would beg her to stay, had to watch her lover fall, and with it, her own reputation. She, who had bet everything on the alliance with a man who could offer her status, now found herself alone, small, unmasked. The company party became the beginning of the end. And the end became my new beginning. He walked out the back door with his cardboard box and the trail of a destroyed reputation. She tried to look for me, explained to me, cried, begged. He said it was a mistake, that it meant nothing, that he loved me. But none of that helped. Her every word felt like just another layer of poison trying to disguise the bitter taste of reality. It wasn't love. It was convenience. It was emotional security while feeding his desire for the forbidden. The most ironic thing of all was seeing how she fell with him. He lost his position, lost his contacts, lost the admiration of his colleagues. Neither friendship survived the scandal. Even those closest to him turned away. Not out of moralism, but because no one wants to be on the side of those who play dirty with their own home. She tried to put herself back on the market, but his surname took away from hers. Two images linked by a public shame that no one wanted to associate with the company itself. They became personas non gratas in the corporate environment. Meanwhile, I was reborn. Not just in power, but in self-esteem. I met someone by chance, someone who listened to my story without judging me, who saw in me the man I no longer saw in the mirror. Someone who didn't carry secrets between the lines, who didn't make promises with a low voice and dark intentions. And next to her, I realized that betrayal did not destroy me. She rebuilt me. Stronger, more lucid, more aware of who I am and what I deserve. But what perhaps no one imagines is that night at the party, when I saw my wife in the boss's arms, what hurt most was not the kiss that almost happened, nor the touch that went beyond the limits. What hurt most was the look. Her look. It was the same look that, years ago, she gave me at the altar. The same shine, the same delivery. But now, directed to another. And it was there, frozen in that scene, that I realized that the love had ended long before I discovered the betrayal. And even after everything, even after she lost everything, even as he was publicly exposed and humiliated for his own greed, there was one last question that still burned in me. A doubt that, no matter how many answers I had found, still whispered at night, when the world fell silent, if I hadn't shown up at that party, how much longer would that lie have lasted? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they reflect harsh truths. Betrayal destroys, corrodes homes, breaks hearts and changes destinies forever. Our goal is to show, without filters, the bitter price of wrong choices. Get ready now to dive into a story shocking, intense and unforgettable. Betrayal begins with a look, but ends with everything falling apart. Good story. Thomas and Emily formed, in everyone's eyes, the type of couple that would easily illustrate the cover of a magazine about mature love and complicity in marriage. He, project development manager at a renowned multinational, she is an internal communications analyst at the same company. They met right there, between meetings and coffee in the corporate cafeteria, in one of those coincidences that seem more like a trap of destiny than luck of chance. Emily had the kind of presence that needed no effort to be noticed. Owner of a calm smile and a look that oscillated between sweetness and rationality, she was admired not only for her impeccable professional attitude, but for a kindness that sounded genuine, even on days when everything around her seemed gray. Thomas, on the other hand, had the ability to command a room with just silence. His charisma was not flashy, but magnetic. A tireless worker, he always maintained an ethical stance and a sense of justice that endeared him to everyone, from interns to directors. They both had something in common, they knew how to hide their pain well. They got married 2 years after their first date. The ceremony was simple, intimate, but marked by a true emotion that brought tears to even the most skeptical ones. Emily entered the church in an elegant and discreet dress, holding her father's hand tightly, while her eyes looked only to Thomas, who was waiting for her at the altar with an expression of childish enchantment and trembling hands. When they said yes, it wasn't out of impulse or illusion. It was a conscious and mature choice between two people who deeply admired each other. Over the years, they built a life that wasn't perfect, but was solid. They had simple rituals that seemed unbreakable, the Sunday sunset walks, the dinners in complicit silence after an exhausting day, the trips to small towns where they could disappear from the world for a few days and remember how it all began. They bought a small but cozy apartment. The walls held more than photographs, they held laughter, disagreements resolved with hugs, muffled cries and plans scribbled on napkins. Time, however, has its own rhythm, and does not always go hand in hand with affection. In recent months, Thomas had been dedicating himself more intensely to a new company project, which could determine his promotion to a senior leadership position. The project required him to spend extra hours at the office, dinners with investors, and short but frequent trips. Emily, in turn, had also taken on new responsibilities, now leading a small but demanding team. Still, even with a busy schedule and tired bodies, there was effort. I make an effort to keep eye contact during conversations, to not let my cell phone steal the few minutes of silence together on the couch, to remember to buy the wine that the other person liked, even without a special reason. Life seemed to go on in a straight line, even though tiredness accumulated like dust that slowly settles on furniture and is only noticeable when sunlight hits it directly. Gradually, longer silences emerged on Saturday mornings, messages not responded to immediately during office hours, and a kind of mutual distraction that was not disinterest but excessive busyness. Still, they followed. They followed out of love, out of respect, out of a story built with sweat and affection. Their love wasn't the kind that showed off on social media, but the kind that endured in the details. Emily loved watching Thomas sleep. I liked the way he frowned, even when he was resting, as if the world was still on alert inside him. Thomas, in turn, felt that Emily's presence in the house was what made any space feel like a home. She was the one who brought the invisible warmth into the rooms, even when she didn't say a word. Co-workers always saw the two as an exemplary couple. Discreet, but affectionate. With a tune that transcended the physical. It was common, at corporate events, to see them laughing in a corner, isolated from the hustle and bustle, as if just each other's company was enough. The naturalness with which they shared their routine led many to believe that they were immune to the erosions of time. But what few knew, and what none of them even dared to verbalize, is that even the most sincere feelings can wear thin when they are not cared for with full attention. And that love, however true it may be, also needs to be nurtured. Despite all the solidity, there were cracks. Emily, every now and then, missed something she couldn't name. It wasn't unhappiness, nor the absence of love. It was an internal restlessness, a kind of light emptiness that appeared on seemingly perfect days. She didn't know if it was about him, about her, or about what they had become together. Thomas also had doubts, but not about Emily. Doubts about what had stopped being outside of work, marriage, the predictable routine. I felt that, even though I had achieved everything I wanted, I had forgotten who I was when I wasn't performing my duties. Professional ambition grew, but along with it came the feeling that something in his essence was disappearing. Still, neither of them talked about it. It was easier to smile and carry on, as they always did. Coexistence with colleagues, especially those closest to leadership, intensified with advances in the project Thomas was working on. Constant meetings with the board required his frequent presence at events, trips and formal lunches. Emily sometimes accompanied him, but over time, she began to refuse invitations due to her own workload. Even so, they participated in the company's most important parties, making a point of maintaining the image of a strong couple, with a strong presence. It was a duo that was admired and respected, even feared by some. After all, their success reflected a rare combination of competence and emotional balance. But even the most attentive eyes do not capture what is hidden behind smiles. And even the most solid routines can harbor secrets. The company's last big party, marked with pomp and expectation, would be a watershed. There were rumors that the new CEO would be present, and that important decisions would be communicated that night. Thomas insisted that Emily go, even though he knew she was exhausted after an intense week. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. It was a symbolic night, after all, and he deserved their support. She put on her best dress, put on the lipstick he liked the most and went down hand in hand with him into the lobby of the hotel where the event would take place. The loud music, the sparkling wine toasts, the smiles distributed with care. Everything seemed normal. Emily greeted acquaintances, exchanged pleasantries, maintained a calm posture. Thomas talked to the directors, smiled naturally, seemed comfortable. An admired couple, envied by many. At one point during the night, she walked away to talk to a colleague. He continued interacting, completing the cycle of greetings with foreign investors. Hours later, the two would meet again in the ballroom, with a more relaxed atmosphere, dancing among colleagues, in a celebratory atmosphere. What no one there knew was that that party marked more than a corporate event. It marked a turning point. A subtle separation between two worlds that, until then, coexisted in balance. And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to stop being just another ordinary couple story. A narrative that seemed to walk along the lines of expectations slowly begins to reveal that something much bigger, and much more painful, was about to emerge. And what Thomas could never imagine that night, and what would completely change the course of his life, was that, behind the looks, the toasts and the rehearsed smiles, something had been carefully planned without him even suspecting it. What his eyes couldn't yet see in that luxurious party was just the surface. The real show was yet to happen, and he had no idea what role they had in store for him. The night after the party was no different than any other. Emily hung her dress carefully, as she always did, and climbed into bed with a silent, almost choreographed routine. Thomas watched her from the bathroom door as she dried her hands, saying nothing. Nothing obvious had happened, no out-of-place gesture, no hurtful words, but something inside him didn't quite fit. He lay down next to her, kissed her forehead and closed his eyes. Fatigue soon overcame him, but the sleep that came was superficial, as if a part of him refused to surrender completely to rest. In the silence of the room, only the hum of the air conditioning broke the monotony, but there was something else. A slight premonition, a restlessness that had no form or name, but that clung to his chest with invisible nails. Over the next few days, Thomas dove back into the project that was taking up most of his energy. The meetings were increasingly tense, the deliveries more demanding and the deadlines shorter. However, something subtly changed in his perception. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Comments between colleagues that were abruptly interrupted when he approached, glances that he could not completely decipher, and a persistent murmur in the hallways that seemed to trail behind him, always without touching him directly. It was as if something was moving on the surface of normality, a hidden current, charged with tension, that everyone pretended not to notice, but that was clearly there. Emily, for her part, seemed more distracted. Although she continued to be affectionate and attentive, there were moments in which her gaze wandered for no reason, as if she were living a parallel story within herself. His responses were automatic, his laughter was more contained, and his physical presence did not guarantee their emotional connection. Thomas watched her from afar, without confronting her. Perhaps out of fear of getting an answer he didn't want to hear, or perhaps out of a blind hope that everything was a product of stress or his imagination, but that emotional distance that was growing between them was not free. It was in the small gestures, in the awkward pauses during meals, in the long silences before going to sleep. One Thursday afternoon, Thomas finished his day earlier than usual. A last-minute cancellation allowed him to leave hours ahead, and he thought about surprising Emily. She stopped by her favorite bakery, bought a box with her favorite sweets and decided to go look for it at work. When he arrived, he noticed that the office was strangely empty for the time. He asked the receptionist if Emily was still there, but she hesitated for a moment before replying that she had left almost an hour ago. Thomas was grateful, but something in the woman's expression made him uneasy. It wasn't the information itself, but the way it was said, a mixture of discomfort and suppressed pity. He stayed in the car for a few minutes, with the box of candy in his hands, not knowing where to go. It wasn't the first time Emily left work early without warning, but there was something in that moment, in that charged silence, that activated a different alarm in him. Over the weeks that followed, Thomas began to observe more closely. Not with paranoia, but with surgical precision. Emily went out more dressed up, changed her perfume frequently, was away from home for long periods with vague explanations, and often left her cell phone out of his sight, as if she was afraid he might read something he shouldn't. Thomas did not confront her. Instead, he decided to seek certainties. He discreetly installed a tracking app on his phone, a decision that tore him apart internally, but which he justified as a desperate measure to regain his peace of mind. I couldn't continue living with assumptions, I needed facts. It was a Friday night when the tracker led him to an address that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a restaurant or an art gallery, as she had said. It was a hotel. One of those executive hotels that were near the financial area. He parked a block away, turned off the engine and waited. He didn't know what exactly he was expecting, maybe to see her go out alone, maybe to find a logical explanation that would dispel his suspicions. But when he saw her leave the main lobby, walking next to a tall man in a dark suit with a familiar expression, time froze. It was his boss. The same one who had offered him advice so many times, who had recommended him for strategic positions, who had spoken on his behalf at key conferences and meetings. They walked together, with a closeness that left no room for doubt. They didn't touch, but they didn't need to. The body language spoke for them. It was an intimate, rehearsed code, full of a naturalness that is only achieved when there is shared history behind it. Thomas didn't get out of the car. He didn't follow them. He didn't scream. He didn't do anything. He stood there, feeling something inside him crumble soundlessly. It wasn't rage that came over him first. It was disbelief. A mixture of nausea, deep sadness and humiliation. He felt ridiculous. For every time he had trusted, for every word he had said with an open heart, for every night he held her believing he was the only one. The pain did not come in the form of a scream, but as a constant pressure on his chest, a feeling of suffocation that forced him to let go of the steering wheel and rest his head on the seat back, closing his eyes tightly, as if he could wake up from a nightmare that had not yet ended. That night he didn't come home. He drove aimlessly for hours, finally stopping at a roadside motel where he asked for a room without giving his name. He didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling for hours, reliving every moment he shared with Emily, every conversation, every recent silence that now had a new meaning. Every memory was contaminated with the image of her leaving the hotel next to another man. Not just any man. Your boss. Someone who was part of his daily routine, who knew his story, his effort, his goals. Betrayal, in that context, was not just emotional. It was a systemic, calculated betrayal that violated every possible code of loyalty and respect. When he returned home the next day, Emily was already waiting for him. He asked her in a soft voice where she had been, why she didn't respond to the messages. Thomas looked at her for a few eternal seconds before answering that he just needed to think. She nodded, without pressing. As if he knew something had changed, but without being sure how much. Over the next few days, the dynamics at home became tense, although silent. None spoke openly. Emily tried to maintain an artificial normality, while Thomas moved like a ghost, fulfilling his obligations without leaving room for confrontation. He observed more, spoke less. I was waiting for the right moment. The breaking point came with the company's anniversary party. Thomas did not plan to attend. His intention was to avoid scenes, not to expose himself to a situation in which he did not trust his own ability to control himself. But he changed his mind at the last minute. Something inside him needed to be there, to see with his own eyes, to face what was tormenting him from the shadows. He didn't warn that he was going. He arrived late, when the room was already full, the lights were low and the music enveloped the atmosphere with an atmosphere of measured euphoria. He walked between the tables, greeted some acquaintances, kept a neutral expression. And then he saw them. On the dance floor. Together. Again. The scene left no room for interpretation. This time they weren't hiding it. The bodies pressed together, the hands in places that went beyond what was acceptable between colleagues, the intimate smiles, the whispers in the ear. Emily looked relaxed, as if the risk didn't exist. The boss, for his part, seemed to enjoy the nerve. No one seemed to notice it, or maybe they all chose to ignore it. But when Thomas stopped a few meters away, observing them with the calm of someone who no longer expects anything, Emily's eyes met his. And in that moment, his face transformed. He froze. The smile faded. The color drained from her cheeks. The boss took a second longer to react, but when he did, his expression was that of someone who knows the costume fell off. Attendees began to notice the weather, the abrupt change in energy. Murmurs. Looks. Some tried to divert attention, others simply watched in silence, knowing they were witnessing something they could not forget. Thomas didn't move. He didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The image spoke for itself. And although that night marked the end of many things, it was also the beginning of a much deeper truth, a truth that still remained hidden, but not for long. That Monday morning, Thomas arrived at the company before everyone else. He wore a dark, impeccable suit and walked with an almost rehearsed serenity, as if each step were part of a script that he himself had written in blood and silence. There was no longer any hesitation in his gestures. In the last few days, he had held discreet meetings, signed contracts that until then had been kept in his drawer and that were now coming to life in documents sealed with a notarized signature. Everything was ready. With each signature, with each conversation with foreign investors who showed interest in taking control of the company's innovation department, Thomas consolidated his turnaround. What few knew was that, while facing the pain of marital betrayal, he coldly engineered the most unexpected professional turnaround. The game, until then handled unfairly by others, was now in their hands. Shortly before the start of the extraordinary meeting, he went up to the top floor, where the board of directors was located, and entered the conference room without announcing. Some executives were already positioned, others were still accommodating. In the center of the table, his boss, the man who until recently smiled as if he had nothing to hide, was leafing through documents with apparent tranquility. Emily wasn't present, at least not yet. The atmosphere was full of expectation, although no one knew exactly why. As Thomas took his place at the head of the table, a subtle buzz spread. It was a symbolic gesture. He had never sat there before. That was the presidency chair. He didn't wait long. He picked up the controller and turned on the main screen. A contract appeared. One of the directors adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Their eyes widened as they read the heading, Term for Partial Acquisition of Shares, Inclusion of New Strategic Partner. Silence took over the room. Thomas stood up, took a deep breath, and spoke with a firmness he had never shown in any previous presentation. He explained that, over the last 3 months, he had been conducting negotiations with an international group that was interested in acquiring a considerable share of the company, and that, after long negotiations, the proposal had been accepted. He was now majority partner in the Innovation and Planning Division. The organizational structure would change. Leadership would change. And with that, his boss's job was over as of that morning. The reaction was immediate. The man stood up abruptly, questioning the legitimacy of the operation, claiming that it was a low blow, that it had not been communicated, that he required the presence of the council. Thomas, with a calm face, simply replied that all documents had already been filed and that any challenge should be made through the legal department, the same legal department that now responded directly to him. And before the former superior could continue, the door to the room opened. Emily entered, eyes wide, visibly surprised to see Thomas there, in that position, in the center of everything. She hesitated as she walked through the door, as if she wasn't sure if she should continue. Thomas's gaze met hers. And for the first time, she didn't know where to hide her eyes. He walked to a chair in the corner of the room and sat down without saying a word. The former boss, furious, threw the folder on the table and left, muttering threats, insults and empty predictions of retaliation. The room remained silent for a few seconds until Thomas ended the meeting with a simple, "It's a new cycle." The executives left one by one, some in silence, others casting surreptitious glances between him and Emily. When they were alone, she tried to get up, but he stopped her with a restrained gesture. It was time for the conversation they had both avoided for days. Emily remained silent, waiting for him to say something. But his silence was heavier than any words. Then she, with a low voice, ventured to say that she didn't know where to start. Thomas remained standing in front of the window, looking at the city from above, before replying that there was no point in starting with anything anymore, because everything she had to say would have sounded better if it had been said before. Emily tried to explain that things had gotten mixed up, that she didn't know what she felt anymore, that she was afraid of hurting him, that she never wanted to hurt him like that. The words came out in a rush, as if they were trying to chase something that was already lost. He turned slowly, and the pain in his eyes was evident, but mixed with something new, disappointment mixed with lucidity. He said that she could have chosen any moment in the life they shared to be honest, but she chose the path of omission, of secrecy, of silent contempt. That it wasn't just about the body, but about the loyalty that was broken so deeply that all the excuses in the world couldn't mend. Emily, now crying, murmured that it had been a mistake, that she was confused, that she thought he didn't care about her anymore, that he was always distant, focused on work. Thomas then walked over to the folder he had brought and opened it on the table. From inside, he took out a sealed envelope, which he placed in front of her. "It's all here," he said, "the receipts, the trails, the dates, the hotel reservations, the emails exchanged, the entry and exit records, the footage from the parking lot security camera. I knew it. I just waited for the right moment to show it." Emily took the envelope with shaking hands, but didn't have the courage to open it. Tears were now flowing uncontrollably. She murmured that there was no point in continuing with that she had already understood, that she was sorry. Thomas didn't react. He sat down in front of her, calmly, and faced her with the firmness of someone who had already decided everything. And then, as if that moment were not enough, as if the betrayal were not enough, he took a deep breath and said what no one else knew, what would redefine the weight of the story. Thomas said that, 3 weeks earlier, during the trip that Emily believed was just his work commitment, he had participated in a much larger negotiation, something she was completely unaware of. He revealed that the investment did not just come from an international group interested in innovation. The chief investor was a name she knew well, the brother of an old colleague of hers, with whom she had had a superficial relationship years ago, and who now returned as a central figure in this entire restructuring. But the most shocking thing came later. Thomas revealed that, during this same negotiation, he discovered, through internal audits, that his former boss had used confidential data and strategies created by him, registered under his name, to present parallel proposals to the board, with the support of a very close collaborator. Emily. The information she passed on wasn't just emotional betrayal. She was a strategic piece used as a link to capture data, analyses, planning reports and projections that fed the lovers' speeches in decisive meetings. Emily, now out of breath, murmured denials, saying that she had no idea, that she had never done this consciously, that she would never pass on confidential information. But Thomas didn't back down. She said that the emails were clear, that the dates matched, that everything she thought were just harmless conversations had been used to directly harm her work, her reputation, and that, while he slept next to her, trusting, she became a fundamental part in his downfall. But instead of falling, he got up. And he came back stronger. Emily tried to touch him, but he backed away. He said there was no more room for explanations. That forgiveness was not a currency he could offer. That she had made her choice. And now, he did his. When she finally asked what was next, he just said that she would receive a formal communication from the company later that day. And, as for his personal life, the divorce documents were already with the lawyer. Emily stood up unsteadily, tried to tell him that she still loved him, that she didn't want to lose everything like this. But Thomas didn't respond. She just collected her papers, kept the envelope that she didn't have the courage to open, and left the room without looking back. That day, for the first time in years, he felt free. The pain was still there, but now it was accompanied by something new, peace. And as he walked down the floors of the company that had once been the scene of his humiliation, it was now the scene of his greatest victory. But there was still more to be discovered. And what came next would make it clear that no matter how far Emily thought she had fallen, she hadn't yet touched bottom. On the afternoon of the same day, after leaving the meeting room as the new face of a leadership that no one predicted, Thomas did not immediately return home. The news of the restructuring spread through the company like wildfire, the corridors were buzzing with speculation and murmurs. The names of Emily and her former boss were on everyone's lips, but no one had the courage to say anything to him. They knew that something much bigger had happened, but the details were still kept only between those involved, and Thomas's silence was more eloquent than any explanation. He went down to the parking lot, got into his car and drove without a defined direction, looking for a place where he could breathe away from the eyes and tensions of that environment. He found refuge in a discreet cafe on the other side of town, the same place where, years ago, he and Emily had discussed plans for the future, dreamed together, made promises that now sounded like words thrown to the wind. Sitting by the window, watching life pass by at a speed that seemed different from his own, he mentally replayed each step he had taken in the last few months. It wasn't just about betrayal or loss, it was about rebuilding. He had lost something essential, the blind trust he always had in people, but, on the other hand, he had rediscovered his own strength. And, in that moment of silent reflection, his cell phone vibrated insistently. It was a call from an unknown number. For a moment, he thought about ignoring it, but he answered. The voice on the other side was cold and objective. One of the lawyers responsible for the acquisition contract wanted to meet him urgently, as new data had emerged that could change the course of the situation with Emily and the former director. Thomas scheduled the meeting for an hour later. The lawyer was waiting for him in a commercial room in the building where the office of the firm responsible for the negotiations was located. Upon arrival, he was greeted formally and taken to a private room. On the table, there was a folder closed with red ribbons. The lawyer, with a serious expression, explained that during the cross-checking of internal records, information had been accidentally discovered. The confidential data that had been passed on by Emily not only fed the former boss with strategic inputs, but was also used to set up a parallel company, registered in the name of third parties, but with initial capital coming from Emily's own financial transactions, extracted from the couple's joint account without Thomas knowing. For a few seconds, Thomas didn't understand what he was hearing. Emily had used marital resources to fuel an underground business, run in the shadows by a man who not only stole her trust, but was now also trying to usurp her professional identity. It was more than betrayal. It was a crime. The lawyer explained that, if Thomas wished, he could take legal action against both the former director and Emily, for misuse of assets and improper association with competing and fraudulent activity. The possibility of arrest was not ruled out. Thomas listened silently, digesting the new layer of destruction unfolding before him. When we left the building, the sun had already dropped below the horizon. He picked up his cell phone, called the divorce lawyer and asked him to set up an immediate meeting with Emily, outside the company's premises. I wanted to end everything, personally, definitively, without scandals, but without concessions. He chose a neutral place, the same cafe where they had been at the beginning of their relationship, in a gesture of irony that only he understood. Emily arrived with her face haggard, her eyes swollen, her shoulders hunched as if carrying an impossible weight. He sat in front of her in silence, and for the first time in many years, he couldn't hold his gaze. Thomas began to speak bluntly. He said he knew about the parallel company, that he already had all the bank statements, proof of transfers, the orange names involved, the signed contracts. Emily widened her eyes, surprised, and murmured that she had no idea he knew that it had all started as an impulsive idea, that the other man convinced her it would be an opportunity, that she never imagined it would take such proportions. She tried to justify it, to say that she was deceived, manipulated, pressured. But Thomas just shook his head in silence, as if every word she spoke was a shovelful of dirt on something that was already buried. When she, crying, said that she was willing to give everything back, to do whatever it took to not lose him, he responded with the coldness of someone who has already gone through all the layers of forgiveness. He said what she took from him was not money. It was the dignity of sharing a life with someone who had become an accomplice of his tormentor. That every night spent sleeping next to him, knowing what he was doing in the shadows, was more cruel than any financial scam. And that, even so, he would not file criminal charges. But I wanted everything back. He wanted part of the assets that belonged to him, he wanted his name cleared of any association with the clandestine company, he wanted the formal and complete separation of any link, financial, emotional or legal, between them. She accepted, between sobs, asking only that she not make it public. Thomas just replied that he didn't need to. The truth, sooner or later, would find its own way. In the following days, activity at the law office was intense. Documents were signed, accounts were closed, properties divided. Emily left the apartment they had bought together and moved into a makeshift studio apartment, with little furniture and almost no dignity. The former director, now being investigated for corporate fraud, has disappeared from the radar. And the shadow company, discovered by the new shareholders, was dismantled, ending any chance of recovery for those who had believed the secrecy and dishonesty would be invisible. Thomas, in turn, continued working on the company's new structure with methodical dedication. He was respected by everyone, but he maintained a clear emotional distance. His days were organized with surgical precision, but the void left by everything he had experienced was still present. Until, on one of those lonely nights, he was invited to a conference on corporate ethics. He accepted on impulse, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of the need to breathe another air. And it was there that he met someone unexpected, someone who wasn't part of his past, didn't know his scars, but who listened to his story without judging, just with empathy. A woman with acute intelligence, an attentive look and a silence that was not burdensome, but comforting. The conversations extended beyond the conference. The coffees came, the leisurely walks, the confidences exchanged little by little. Thomas wasn't in love, not yet. But I felt, for the first time in a long time, that it was possible to start over without carrying pain as an identity. That there were people who wanted nothing from him other than his true presence. That life, even after so much, could offer another chance, cleaner, more honest. And that love, if it came again, would come in a different way, without illusion, but with completeness. Emily, now away from everything and everyone, watched this new chapter from afar. I knew there was no return. She had lost more than a marriage, she had lost the only man who really saw her. And what hurt most wasn't the loneliness. It was knowing that, when he had everything, he chose to risk it for something that never had value. It was no longer about regret. It was about learning to live with the weight of all the choices made. And this weight, she would carry alone. Thomas was no longer the same man who went unnoticed in the corridors with a calm look and measured steps. Something had definitely changed in his way of existing. It wasn't just the firmer stance or the more reserved expression, it was the way he now carried the absence of expectations, like someone who understands that living with a minimum of illusions is the safest way to protect oneself from the abyss of disappointment. The betrayal had not only broken the bond with Emily, nor was it restricted to a marital issue. What had been broken was an entire system of beliefs, a structure of trust carefully built over a lifetime, which now lay in ruins, requiring an emotional reconstruction based on entirely new premises. The lucidity this brought, although liberating, also exposed him to a silent and continuous dilemma: how to start over without carrying the weight of revenge on his shoulders, how not to allow pain to forever shape his view of the world and people. He continued with his work, meetings and commitments, but avoided relationships that could become too deep. The woman he had met at the conference was still present in his life, but at a frequency carefully moderated by him. He felt torn between the genuine desire to explore that new connection and the unconscious fear of trusting fully again. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but I didn't want to be hurt again either. Every step taken toward intimacy was measured, weighed, and often slowed by an inner voice that warned him that nothing is as safe as it seems. Still, there was tenderness in the meetings, there was restrained laughter, and a certain relief at discovering that someone could approach without the need to invade. But even with this new presence, the nights were filled with restless thoughts. Emily, for her part, struggled with a routine that seemed to implode in on itself. The apartment where he lived was small, stuffy, and without any trace of the life he once shared with Thomas. The walls seemed to tighten around each new dawn. Without a job, without prestige, with few friends who still responded to her messages, she had to deal with a version of herself that she never imagined she would encounter. It wasn't the material losses that hurt her most, although the lack of stability brought constant anguish, it was the awareness of what she had done. She had crossed lines that could no longer be erased, and even though she tried to justify to herself that she was led by impulsiveness or the manipulation of others, deep down she knew that everything she experienced was, to some degree, her own choice. And that realization hurt more than any external punishment. The days began to drag on in a silent cycle of regret and loneliness. Emily tried some attempts to reconnect with old colleagues, looked for smaller job openings, tried to occupy her mind with simple tasks, but there was something she was deeply lacking: purpose. Without Thomas, without the corporate universe that validated her, without the masks that supported her, she had to face the woman she really was, and that, for her, was the worst kind of punishment. One afternoon he decided to write a letter. Not to ask for forgiveness, but to try to put into words everything he couldn't say. With each line written, I felt his fingers tremble. He explained what he felt, what he thought he was looking for, how he got lost in his own decisions. He recognized, crudely, that perhaps he had never really understood himself, and that he only realized this when he had already lost everything. He didn't expect an answer, but he needed those words to exist, to be outside his mind, printed on paper as a form of testimony to his own ruin. When Thomas received the letter, he hesitated before opening it. 2 days passed until, one night, while lying down, he carefully tore it up and began to read. The words, although painful, did not surprise him. But something there moved at a specific point. There was no request for reconciliation, nor attempts to alleviate what had happened. It was just a naked record of someone who finally saw themselves without masks. And that, oddly enough, had more of an impact on him than if she had begged for forgiveness. There was no turning back, there was no future between them. But perhaps, after that reading, there would be a chance to let go of the past with less rancor. Didn't forget. He didn't forgive. But for the first time he felt he could move forward without carrying her name like an open wound. The days became less heavy. The new relationship began to take on a more defined shape, even though he insisted on maintaining a certain emotional distance. The woman with whom he now shared coffees and evening walks didn't pressure, didn't demand, didn't invade. She just existed next to him, and that, for Thomas, was a breather. In one of these conversations, as they walked through an almost empty park at dusk, she told him that there was something admirable about his way of dealing with pain, but that, at the same time, it was sad to see him living as if he was always waiting for the next blow. These words echoed inside him for days, like a small crack that gradually expands. Maybe she was right. Maybe he was so busy avoiding suffering that he no longer knew how to allow himself to feel anything. Meanwhile, investigations into the company's former director progressed. The press began to raise suspicions about parallel deals and shady contracts. The man's reputation, already shaken, became total ruin. No one mentioned him at meetings anymore, not even to comment on his disappearance. His name has become something of a taboo, a grim reminder that even the most charismatic and influential can fall. Thomas watched everything from a distance. Not with pleasure, but with the coldness of someone who understands that certain consequences are inevitable. He didn't want revenge. But he wanted the truth to be exposed, so that other people wouldn't fall into the same trap. One evening, as Thomas was leaving a longer meeting, he received an unexpected call from an old colleague in the legal department. The man seemed tense, hesitant, but there was something that needed to be said. He reported that, among the documents being reviewed by the authorities, additional information emerged that would directly involve him. There was a hidden clause, registered months before, in which his name appeared as co-responsible for an investment fund used in the fraud. Thomas was silent for a long moment. He knew he hadn't authorized anything, but that meant they had used his identity to shield the operation. The information hit him like a cold wave. Even though he had won the personal and professional battle, he now found himself involved in an investigation that could tarnish his reputation and place him under suspicion. The evidence of forgery was still fragile. I would need to act quickly. He immediately called his lawyers, started a private audit, retrieved old records, receipts, exchanged messages, everything that could prove that there was no intentional connection with the fund in question. It was another test, another layer of wear, as if history refused to grant him definitive peace. But there was a fundamental difference now. Thomas was no longer driven by anger. He was lucid, attentive and prepared. It was another man. More resistant. More strategic. During the defense process, his new partner was by his side. Not with empty promises or theatrical gestures, but with presence. It was in the silences between one paragraph and another of each document, in the coffees left next to his desk, in the simple questions like, "Have you eaten today?" that Thomas realized the type of love that is reborn when it is not required. A love that does not try to heal wounds, but that accepts that they exist and walk together. Emily, on the other hand, learned of the new accusation from outside sources and, in a desperate impulse, tried to get in touch. He sent a short message, saying that if he needed proof that she didn't directly involve him, she would be willing to testify. Thomas read the message in silence. He didn't respond. He knew it could be genuine, but he also knew that, after all, the only voice he needed to hear was his own. And at that moment, his inner voice was already clear. I was ready to leave the past where it belonged. The story was heading towards an end, but not just any end. It was the kind of outcome that didn't come with fireworks or explicit justice, but with the painful maturity of someone who learned, by the cruelest of paths, that true power lies not in destroying others, but in rebuilding oneself. And when everything seemed to calm down, when the waters began to slowly recede, something was still waiting to be revealed, something that would change not only Thomas's trajectory, but also that of those who, in silence, continued to watch everything from the sidelines. The audit process progressed like a silent storm, consuming weeks of investigations, reports, back and forth between lawyers, depositions and documentary confrontations. Thomas, despite no longer being the subject of a formal accusation, knew that all it took was one mistake, a misinterpreted signature, a poorly explained connection and the entire castle, rebuilt with so much effort, could collapse. But he also knew who he was now. He was no longer shaking when he heard his name involved in something he didn't commit. He no longer despaired at the thought of his tarnished public image. He was ready to face anything, because he finally understood that his integrity no longer depended on external recognition, but on the tranquility that inhabited his conscience. And this one, as stormy as it had been, was clean. The final result of the investigation was formally presented in a discreet meeting with the legal committee and the investor group. The forgery of his signature had been proven, the improper access tracked and the attempt to involve him in the scheme dismantled with solid evidence. His name was removed from any suspicious links. The former director, on the other hand, was indicted, with an arrest warrant issued after months of absence and silence. He was found in another country, living under a false name, and extradited after a joint operation. His image, previously linked to prestige and influence, became headlines in all media outlets as a symbol of corporate corruption and professional betrayal. His fall was definitive, with no possibility of return. Emily, who had chosen not to try to make contact anymore, continued her life in a recluse, without major events, away from the networks, away from everything that once offered her some validation. Even without legal punishment, the shame turned into a slow, daily punishment that ate away at her from the inside out. Her name, even though it was not officially revealed, was cited in restricted circles as a key part of the downfall. No one pointed it out publicly, but everyone knew. She was the one who traded loyalty for opportunity, who gave in to the whims of a lover for mismanaged ambition. The only thing she still had was the memory of what she destroyed with her own hands. He tried to rebuild his life professionally, but was never able to overcome the trust barriers. No company wanted someone whose past was shrouded in suspicion, even if there was no formal conviction. She ended up finding temporary work in a clothing store, dealing with the exhausting routine of retail, observing the flow of people who, unlike her, still had somewhere to return with dignity. Thomas, now free from all shadows, decided to step away from the company completely after the scandal was resolved. He sold his share to investors and refused tempting offers from other corporations. He felt that his cycle in that universe had ended. I no longer wanted to live in meeting rooms where ambition spoke louder than ethics. With the money from the sale, he bought a house outside the central region, surrounded by greenery and silence. Little by little, he began to invest in small social projects aimed at young entrepreneurs. He found a more serene purpose there, more connected with what he wanted to be from now on, a man who transforms pain into a legacy. The relationship with the woman at the conference blossomed surprisingly naturally. Time, now free from open wounds, allowed affection to grow without haste, without pressure. She knew his history, his traumas, but she never treated him as someone broken. She saw him as someone who had been reborn, and he, in turn, finally allowed himself to believe that he could love without fear of being betrayed. The two built a light daily routine together, full of honest exchanges and respected individual spaces. There were no more blind idealizations or unnecessary promises. There was just the daily decision to stay together because they wanted to, not because they had to. One autumn afternoon, as he watched the orange sky from the porch of his new home, Thomas held an old letter, the one Emily had written months before. He read it again, with different eyes. There was no hurt, no longing, just the certainty that some stories were not made to last, but to teach. He kept the letter in a wooden box along with other fragments of his past history. It was time to close that chapter once and for all. And he did so not with anger, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that pushed him to change, for the losses that taught him to choose himself, and for the ruptures that paved the way for something new and true. Life, now, was made of softer silences. Of leisurely mornings. Of quiet dinners. Of dialogues that did not hide ulterior motives. The shadow of betrayal dissolved in the light of full awareness. And the feeling of justice, even if silent, was clear. It was not the justice of revenge, but the justice of restored balance. The traitor paid with his freedom, the accomplice with oblivion, and he, the betrayed, rebuilt himself on a level that no one else could touch. And if there is anything to be said at the end of this story, it is that not all pain is the end. Sometimes the pain passes. Sometimes the greatest gift life gives us comes wrapped in chaos, disappointment, and tears. And those who break us without mercy also free us from the illusions that prevent us from growing. Thomas was not avenged, he was transformed. Emily wasn't punished, she was left behind. And the world, however cruel it may seem, ends up giving each person exactly what they cultivated. Now we want to know what you thought of this story. Leave your comment, share your opinion with us. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity to subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the next stories. And never forget, here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but the pain they portray is real, and serves as a warning about how much our choices shape the destinies of everyone around us. Until the next story.